going to be coming from the Gospel of Matthew, the 18th chapter. And today's text will be dealing with who the greatest is within the kingdom of heaven. The disciples came to Jesus with a burning question. The burning question was, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And what they were really asking is, how is the kingdom of heaven set up in terms of hierarchy, in terms of power and authority, in terms of who will be highly esteemed and recognized? What is the basis of authoritative recognition? You know, who is the greatest? Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, we know that they weren't talking about Jesus himself, but that was already understood that Jesus is the greatest in the kingdom. But they were really asking about their own status. What would be their status? What's the criteria? What does that look like in the kingdom of heaven? And so Jesus takes time to share with them and also provide an example, a demonstration of who the greatest in the kingdom would be. So let's take a look at what Scripture says, what Jesus himself says about who the greatest in the kingdom is. Chapter 18, verse 1. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Verse 2. And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them. Verse 3. And said, verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Verse 4. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Two very important verses there, verse 3 and verse 4, because within these two verses, Jesus breaks down and explains who is the greatest within the kingdom. Verse 3, and said, verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. The question wasn't asked, how do we get into the kingdom of heaven? The question was, Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? But what Jesus does is he kind of sets up the criteria altogether. He tries to give them an example of who can be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. But before you can even be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, he wanted to make it clear that you first have to be in the kingdom of heaven. And basically, the same criteria that's necessary to be in the kingdom of heaven is the same criteria that's necessary to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And that criteria is humility. Very simple. There's no deep exegesis here, no exhaustive commentary here. Jesus makes it very plain, very clear that the criteria for being the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the same criteria for being in or associated within the kingdom of heaven, and that is to come as a little child. What was the demonstration that Jesus set before the disciples, which pointed to humility, that gave them an immediate example of humility? It was when he called the little child, and the child came in their midst. In verse 2, it says, and Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them. The very simple act of the child responding to his call was an act of humility. Let me set that up again. The very simple act of the child responding to the call of Jesus was an act of humility on the part of the child. That was the demonstration. That was the example. That's the criteria for being the greatest in the kingdom, but also for gaining access into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, In other words, just as this little child just did. When I called the child didn't run the opposite direction. The child came to Jesus willingly. Immediately, the child humbled itself. And what did Jesus say? Whoso therefore shall humble himself as this little child, now the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So we see that humility is the access key into the kingdom of heaven. We see that humility is also the access requirement for being the greatest within the kingdom of heaven. Very simple. So access into the kingdom and being the greatest within the kingdom centers around humility.